Hawthorne and His Mosses, read for Noetic by Luke Johnson. This recording copyright 2020 Noetic Series LLC, all rights reserved. Hawthorne and His Mosses by a Virginian spending July in Vermont. A papered chamber in a fine old farmhouse, a mile from any other dwelling, and dipped to the eaves in foliage, surrounded by mountains, old woods, and Indian pools. This surely is the place to write of Hawthorne. Some charm is in this northern air, for love and duty seem both impelling to the task. A man of a deep and noble nature has seized me in this seclusion. His wild witch voice rings through me, or in softer cadences I seem to hear it in the songs of the hillside birds that sing in the larch trees at my window. Would that all excellent books were foundlings, without father or mother, that so it might be we could glorify them, without including their ostensible authors. Nor would any true man take exception to this, least of all he who writes when the artist rises high enough to achieve the beautiful, the symbol by which he makes it perceptible to mortal senses, becomes of little value in his eyes, while his spirit possesses itself in the enjoyment of the reality. But more than this, I know not what would be the right name to put on the title page of an excellent book. But this I feel, that the names of all fine authors are fictitious ones, far more so than that of Junius, simply standing, as they do, for the mystical, ever-eluding spirit of all beauty, which ubiquitously possesses men of genius. Purely imaginative as this fancy may appear, it nevertheless seems to receive some warranty from the fact that on a personal interview, no great author has ever come up to the idea of his reader, but that of dust of which our bodies are composed. How can it fitly express the nobler intelligences among us? With reverence be it spoken that not even in the case of one deemed more than man, not even in our Savior, did his visible frame betoken anything of the augustness of the nature within. Else how could those Jewish eyewitnesses fail to see heaven in his glance? It is curious how a man may travel along a country road and yet miss the grandest or sweetest of prospects by reason of an intervening hedge. So like all other hedges, as in no way to hint of the wide landscape beyond, so has it been with me concerning the enchanting landscape in the soul of this Hawthorne, this most excellent man of mosses. His Old Manse has been written now 4 years, but I never read it till a day or two since. I had seen it in the bookstores, heard of it often, even had it recommended to me by a tasteful friend, as a rare quiet book, perhaps too deserving of popularity to be popular. But there are so many books called excellent, and so much unpopular merit, that amid the thick stir of other things, the hint of my tasteful friend was disregarded, and for 4 years the mosses on the Old Manse never refreshed me with their perennial green. It may be, however, that all this while the book, likewise, was only improving in flavor and body. At any rate, it so chanced that this long procrastination eventuated in a happy result. At breakfast the other day, a mountain girl, a cousin of mine, who for the last 2 weeks has every morning helped me to strawberries and raspberries, which, like the roses and pearls in the fairy tale, seem to fall into the saucer from those strawberry beds, her cheeks, this delightful creature, this charming cherry, says to me, "I see you spend your mornings in the haymow, and yesterday I found there Dwight's Travels in New England. Now I have something far better than that, something more congenial to our summer on these hills. Take these raspberries, and then I will give you some moss. Moss, said I. Yes, and you must take it to the barn with you, and goodbye to Dwight. With that, she left me and soon returned with a volume, verdantly bound and garnished with a curious frontispiece in green, nothing less than a fragment of real moss, cunningly pressed to a flyleaf. Why this, said I, spilling my raspberries. This is the mosses from an old manse. Yes, said Cousin Cherry. Yes, it is that flowery hawthorn. Hawthorne and mosses, said I. No more it is morning, it is July in the country, and I am off for the barn. Stretched on that new mown clover, the hillside breeze blowing over me through the wide barn door, and soothed by the hum of the bees in the meadows around, how magically stole over me this mossy man, and how amply, how bountifully did he redeem that delicious promise to his guests in the old manse, of whom it is written, others could give them pleasure or amusement or instruction. These could be picked up anywhere, but it was for me to give them rest, rest in a life of trouble. What better could be done for those weary and world-worn spirits? What better could be done for anybody who came within our magic circle than to throw the spell of a tranquil spirit over him? So all that day, half buried in the new clover, I watched this Hawthorne's Assyrian dawn and Pamphian sunset and moonrise from the summit of our eastern hill. The soft ravishments of the man spun me round about in a web of dreams, and when the book was closed, when the spell was over, the wizard dismissed me with but misty reminiscences, as if I had been dreaming of him. What a wild moonlight of contemplative humor bathes that old manse, the rich and rare distilment of a spicy and slowly oozing heart. No rollicking rudeness, no gross fun fed on fat dinners, and bred in the lees of wine, but a humor so spiritually gentle, so high, so deep, and yet so richly relishable, that it were hardly inappropriate in an angel. It is the very religion of mirth, for nothing so human, but it may be advanced to that. The orchard of the old manse seems the visible type of the fine mind that has described it. Those twisted and contorted old trees, they stretch out their crooked branches and take such hold of the imagination that we remember them as humorous and oddfellows. And then, as surrounded by these grotesque forms and hushed in the noonday repose of this Hawthorne spell, how aptly might the still fall of his ruddy thoughts into your soul be symbolized by, in the stillest afternoon, if I listened, the thump of a great apple was audible, falling without a breath of wind, from the mere necessity of perfect ripeness. For no less ripe than ruddy are the apples of the thoughts and fancies in this sweet man of mosses. Buds and bird voices, what a delicious thing is that! Will the world ever be so decayed that spring may not renew its greenness? And the fire worship, was ever the hearth so glorified into an altar before? The mere title of that piece is better than any common work in 50-folio volumes. How exquisite is this! Nor did it lessen the charm of his soft, familiar courtesy and helpfulness that the mighty spirit, where opportunity offered him, would run riot through the peaceful house, wrap its inmates in his terrible embrace, and leave nothing of them save their whitened bones. This possibility of mad destruction only made his domestic kindness the more beautiful and touching. It was so sweet of him, being endowed with such power, to dwell day after day, and one long lonesome night after another, on the dusky hearth, only now and then betraying his wild nature by thrusting his red tongue out of the chimney top. True, he had done much mischief in the world and was pretty certain to do more, but his warm heart atoned for all. He was kindly to the race of man, and they pardoned his characteristic imperfections. But he has still other apples not quite so ruddy, though full as ripe, apples that have been left to wither on the tree, after the pleasant autumn gathering is past. The sketch of the old apple dealer is conceived in the subtlest spirit of sadness. He whose subdued and nerveless boyhood prefigured his abortive prime, which likewise contained within itself the prophecy and image of his lean and torpid age. Such touches as are in this piece cannot proceed from any common heart. They argue such a depth of tenderness, such a boundless sympathy with all forms of being, such an omnipresent love, that we must needs say that this Hawthorne is here almost alone in his generation, at least in the artistic manifestation of these things. Still more, such touches as these and many, very many similar ones, all through his chapters, furnish clues whereby we enter a little way into the intricate, profound heart where they originated, and we see that suffering some time or other, and in some shape or other. This only can enable any man to depict it in others. All over him Hawthorne's melancholy rests like an Indian summer, which, though bathing a whole country in one softness, still reveals the distinctive hue of every towering hill and each far-winding vale. But it is the least part of genius that attracts admiration. Where Hawthorne is known, he seems to be deemed a pleasant writer with a pleasant style, a sequestered, harmless man from whom any deep and weighty thing would hardly be anticipated, a man who means no meanings. But there is no man in whom humor and love, like mountain peaks, soar to such a rapt height as to receive the irradiations of the upper skies. There is no man in whom humor and love are developed in that high form called genius. No such man can exist without also possessing, as the indispensable complement of these, a great deep intellect, which drops down into the universe like a plummet, or love and humor are only the eyes through which such an intellect views this world. The great beauty in such a mind is but the product of its strength. What to all readers can be more charming than the piece entitled Monsieur du Miraire, and to a reader at all capable of fully fathoming it, what at the same time can possess more mystical depth of meaning? Yes, there he sits and looks at me, this shape of mystery, this identical Monsieur du Miroir. Methinks I should tremble now, were his wizard power of gliding through all impediments in search of me to place him suddenly before my eyes. How profound, nay appalling, is the moral evolved by the earth's holocaust, where, beginning with the hollow follies and affections of the world, all vanities and empty theories and forms are one after another, and by an admirably graduated growing comprehensiveness, thrown into the allegorical fire, till at length nothing is left but the all-engendering heart of man, which remaining still unconsumed, the great conflagration is not. Of a piece with this is the Intelligence Office, a wondrous symbolizing of the secret workings in men's souls. There are other sketches still more charged with ponderous import. The Christmas Banquet and the Bosom Serpent would be fine subjects for a curious and elaborate analysis, touching the conjectural parts of the mind that produced them. For spite of all the Indian summer sunlight on the hither side of Hawthorne's soul, the other side, like the dark half of the physical sphere, is shrouded in a blackness 10 times black. But this darkness but gives more effect to the ever-moving dawn that forever advances through it and circumnavigates his world, Whether Hawthorne has simply availed himself of this mystical blackness as a means of the wondrous effects he makes it to produce in his lights and shades, or whether there really lurks in him, perhaps unknown to himself, a touch of puritanic gloom. This I cannot altogether tell. Certain it is, however, that this great power of blackness in him derives its force from its appeals to that Calvinistic sense of innate depravity and original sin, from whose visitations in some shape or other no deeply thinking mind is always and wholly free. For in certain moods no man can weigh the world without throwing in something like original sin to strike the uneven balance. At all events, perhaps no writer has ever wielded this terrific thought with greater terror than this same harmless Hawthorne. Still more, the black conceit pervades him through and through. You may be bewitched by his sunlight, transported by the bright gildings in the skies he builds over you. But there is the blackness of darkness beyond, and even his bright gildings but fringe and play upon the edges of thunderclouds. In one word, the world is mistaken in this Nathaniel Hawthorne. He himself must often have smiled at its absurd misconception of him. He is immeasurably deeper than the plummet of the mere critic, for it is not the brain that contests such a man, it is only the heart. You cannot come to know greatness by inspecting it. There is no glimpse to be caught of it, except by intuition. You need not ring it. You but touch it, and you find it is gold. Now it is that blackness in Hawthorne, of which I have spoken, that so fixes and fascinates me. It may be, nevertheless, that it is too largely developed in him. Perhaps he does not give us a ray of light for every shade of his dark. But however this may be, this blackness it is that furnishes the infinite obscure of his background. That background against which Shakespeare plays his grandest conceits, the things that have made for Shakespeare his loftiest but most circumscribed renown as the profoundest of thinkers. For by philosophers, Shakespeare is not adored as the great man of tragedy and comedy. Off with his head, so much for Buckingham. This sort of rant, interlined by another hand, brings down the house. Those mistaken souls who dream of Shakespeare as a mere man of Richard III, humps, and Macbeth daggers, but it is those deep, far-away things in him, those occasional flashings forth of the intuitive truth in him, those short, quick probings at the very axis of reality. These are the things that make Shakespeare, Shakespeare, through the mouths of the dark characters of Hamlet, Timon, Lear, and Iago. He craftily says, or sometimes insinuates, the things which we feel to be so terrifically true, that it were all but madness for any good man in his own proper character to utter or even hint of them. Tormented into desperation, Lear, the frantic king, tears off the mask and speaks the same madness of vital truth. But as I before said, it is the least part of genius that attracts admiration. And so much of the blind, unbridled admiration that has been heaped upon Shakespeare has been lavished upon the least part of him, and few of his endless commentators and critics seem to have remembered or even perceived that the immediate products of a great mind are not so great as that undeveloped and sometimes undevelopable yet dimly discernible greatness to which those immediate products are but the infallible indices. In Shakespeare's tomb lies infinitely more than Shakespeare ever wrote, and if I magnify Shakespeare, it is not so much for what he did do as for what he did not do, or refrain from doing. For in this world of lies, truth is forced to fly like a scared white doe in the woodlands, and only by cunning glimpses will she reveal herself, as in Shakespeare and other masters of the great art of telling the truth, even though it be covertly and by snatches. But if this view of the all popular Shakespeare be seldom taken by his readers, and if very few who extol him have ever read him deeply, or perhaps only have seen him on the tricky stage, which alone made and is still making him his mere mob renown, if few men have time or patience or palate for the spiritual truth as it is in the great genius, it is then no matter of surprise that in a contemporaneous age, Nathaniel Hawthorne is a man as yet almost utterly mistaken among men. Here and there, in some quiet armchair in the noisy town, or some deep nook among the noiseless mountains, he may be appreciated for something of what he is. But unlike Shakespeare, who was forced to the contrary course by circumstances, Hawthorne, either from simple disinclination or else from inaptitude, refrains from all the popularizing noise and show of broad farce and blood-besmeared tragedy, content with the still rich utterance of a great intellect in repose, and which sends few thoughts into circulation except they be arterialized at his large, warm lungs and expanded in his honest heart. Nor need you fix upon that blackness in him if it suit you not, nor indeed will all readers discern it, for it is mostly insinuated to those who may best understand it and account for it. It is not obtruded upon everyone alike. Some may start to read of Shakespeare and Hawthorne on the same page. They may say that if an illustration were needed, a lesser light might have sufficed to elucidate this Hawthorne, this small man of yesterday. But I am not willingly one of those who, as touching Shakespeare at least, exemplify the maxim of Rochefoucauld, that we exalt the reputation of some in order to depress that of others, who to teach all noble-souled aspirants that there is no hope for them, pronounce Shakespeare absolutely unapproachable. But Shakespeare has been approached. There are minds that have gone as far as Shakespeare into the universe, and hardly a mortal man who at some time or other has not felt as great thoughts in him as any you will find in Hamlet. We must not inferentially malign mankind for the sake of any one man, whoever he may be. This is too cheap a purchase of contentment for conscious mediocrity to make. Besides, this absolute and unconditional adoration of Shakespeare has grown to be a part of our Anglo-Saxon superstitions. The 39 articles are now 40. And tolerance has come to exist in this matter. You must believe in Shakespeare's unapproachability or quit the country. But what sort of a belief is this for an American, a man who is bound to carry Republican progressiveness into literature as well as into life? Believe me, my friends, that men not very much inferior to Shakespeare are this day being born on the banks of the Ohio. And the day will come when you shall say, who reads a book by an Englishman that is a modern? The great mistake seems to be that even with those Americans who look forward to the coming of a great literary genius among us, they somehow fancy he will come in the costume of Queen Elizabeth's day, be a writer of dramas founded upon Old English history or the tales of Boccaccio. Whereas great geniuses are parts of the times, they themselves are the times and possess a corresponding coloring. It is of a piece with the Jews, who while their Shiloh was meekly walking in their streets, were still praying for his magnificent coming, looking for him in a chariot, who was already among them on an ass. Nor must we forget that in his own lifetime, Shakespeare was not Shakespeare, but only Master William Shakespeare of the shrewd, thriving business firm of Condell, Shakespeare and Company, proprietors of the Globe Theatre in London, and by a courtly author of the name of Chettle, was looked at as an upstart crow, beautified with other birds' feathers. For market well imitation is often the first charge brought against originality. Why this is so, there is not space to set forth here. You must have plenty of sea room to tell the truth in, especially when it seems to have an aspect of newness, as America did in 1492, though it was then just as old and perhaps older than Asia. Only those sagacious philosophers, the common sailors, had never seen it before, swearing it was all water and moonshine there. Now, I do not say that Nathaniel of Salem is a greater man than William of Avon, or as great, but the difference between the two men is by no means immeasurable, not a very great deal more, and Nathaniel were verily William. This too I mean that if Shakespeare has not been equaled, give the world time, and he is sure to be surpassed in one hemisphere or the other. Nor will it at all do to say that the world is getting gray and grizzled now, and has lost that fresh charm which she wore of old, and by virtue of which the great poets of past times made themselves what we esteem them to be. Not so. The world is as young today as when it was created, and this Vermont morning dew is as wet to my feet as Eden's dew to Adam's. Nor has nature been all over ransacked by our progenitors, so that no new charms and mysteries remain for this latter generation to find. Far from it. The trillionth part has not yet been said, and all that has been said but multiplies the avenues to what remains to be said. It is not so much paucity as superabundance of material that seems to incapacitate modern authors. Let America then prize and cherish her writers, yea, let her glorify them. They are not so many in number as to exhaust her goodwill. And while she has good kith and kin of her own to take to her bosom, let her not lavish her embraces upon the household of an alien. For believe it or not, England, after all, is in many things an alien to us. China has more bonds of real love for us than she. But even were there no strong literary individualities among us, as there are some dozens at least, nevertheless, let America first praise mediocrity, even in her children, before she praises, for everywhere merit demands acknowledgement from everyone, the best excellence in the children of any other land. Let her own authors, I say, have the priority of appreciation. I was much pleased with a hot-headed Carolina cousin of mine, who once said, if there were no other American to stand by in literature, why then I would stand by Pop Emmons and his Fredonayad, and till a better epic came along, swear it was not very far behind the Iliad. Take away the words, and in spirit he was sound. Not that American genius needs patronage in order to expand, for that explosive sort of stuff will expand, though screwed up in a vice and burst it, though it were triple steel. It is for the nation's sake, and not for her author's sake, that I would have America be heedful of the increasing greatness among her writers. For how great the shame if other nations should be before her, and crowning her heroes of the pen. But this is almost the case now. American authors have received more just and discriminating praise, however loftily and ridiculously given in certain cases, even from some Englishmen, than from their own countrymen. There are hardly 5 critics in America, and several of them are asleep. As for patronage, it is the American author who now patronizes his country, and not his country him. And if at times some among them appeal to the people for more recognition, it is not always with selfish motives, but patriotic ones. It is true that but few of them as yet have evinced that decided originality which merits great praise, but that graceful writer who perhaps of all Americans has received the most plaudits from his own country for his productions. That very popular and amiable writer, however good and self reliant in many things, perhaps owes his chief reputation to the self acknowledged imitation of a foreign model, and to the studied avoidance of all topics but smooth ones. But it is better to fail in originality than to succeed in imitation. He who has never failed somewhere, that man cannot be great. Failure is the true test of greatness, and if it be said that continual success is a proof that a man wisely knows his powers, it is only to be added that in that case he knows them to be small. Let us believe it then once for all that there is no hope for us in these smooth, pleasing writers that know their powers. Without malice, but to speak the plain fact, they but furnish an appendix to Goldsmith and other English authors. And we want no American Goldsmiths. Nay, we want no American Miltons. It were the vilest thing you could say of a true American author that he were an American Tompkins. Call him an American and have done, for you cannot say a nobler thing of him. But it is not meant that all American writers should studiously cleave to nationality in their writings. Only this: no American writer should write like an Englishman or a Frenchman. Let him write like a man, for then he will be sure to write like an American. Let us away with this leaven of literary flunkyism towards England. If either must play the flunky in this thing, let England do it, not us, while we are rapidly preparing for that political supremacy among the nations which prophetically awaits us at the close of the present century. In a literary point of view, we are deplorably unprepared for it, and we seem studious to remain so. Hitherto reasons might have existed why this should be, but no good reason exists now. And all that is requisite to amendment in this matter is simply this: that while fully acknowledging all excellence everywhere, we should refrain from unduly lauding foreign writers, and at the same time duty recognize the meritorious writers that are our own, those writers who breathe that unshackled democratic spirit of Christianity in all things, which now takes the practical lead in this world. Though at the same time led by ourselves, us Americans, let us boldly condemn all imitation, though it comes to us graceful and fragrant at the morning, and foster all originality, though at first it be crabbed and ugly as our own pine knots. And if any of our authors fail or seem to fail, then in the words of my Carolina cousin, let us clap him on the shoulder and back him against all Europe for his second round. The truth is that in one point of view, this matter of a national literature has come to pass with us, that in some sense we must turn bullies, else the day is lost, or superiority so far beyond us that we can hardly say it will ever be ours. And now, my countrymen, as an excellent author of your own flesh and blood, an unimitating and perhaps in his way an inimitable man, whom better can I commend to you in the first place than Nathaniel Hawthorne? He is one of the new and far better generation of your writers. The smell of young beeches and hemlocks is upon him. Your own broad prairies are in his soul. And if you travel away inland into his deep and noble nature, you will hear the far roar of his Niagara. Give not over to future generations the glad duty of acknowledging him for what he is. Take that joy to yourself in your own generation, and so shall he feel those grateful impulses on him that may possibly prompt him to the full flower of some still greater achievement in your eyes. And by confessing him, you thereby confess others. You brace the whole brotherhood. For genius all over the world stands hand in hand, and one shock of recognition runs the whole circle round. In treating of Hawthorne, or rather of Hawthorne in his writings, for I never saw the man, and in the chances of a quiet plantation life remote from his haunts, perhaps never shall, in treating of his works, I say I have thus far omitted all mention of his Twice Told Tales and Scarlet Letter. Both are excellent, but full of such manifold strange and diffusive beauties that time would all but fail me to point the half of them out. But there are things in those two books which, had they been written in England a century ago, Nathaniel Hawthorne had utterly displaced many of the bright names we now revere on authority. But I am content to leave Hawthorne to himself, and to the infallible finding of posterity, and however great may be the praise I have bestowed upon him, I feel that in so doing, I have served and honored myself than him. For at bottom, great excellence is praise enough to itself, but the feeling of a sincere and appreciative love and admiration towards it, this is relieved by utterance, and warm, honest praise ever leaves a pleasant flavor in the mouth, and it is an honorable thing to confess to what is honorable in others. But I cannot leave my subject yet. No man can read a fine author and relish him to his very bones while he reads, without subsequently fancying to himself some ideal image of the man and his mind. And if you rightly look for it, you will almost always find that the author himself has somewhere furnished you with his own picture. For poets, whether in prose or verse, being painters by nature, are like their brethren of the pencil, the true portrait painters, who in the multitude of likenesses to be sketched do not invariably omit their own. And in all high instances they paint them without any vanity, though at times with a lurking something that would take several pages to properly define. I submit it then to those best acquainted with the man personally, whether the following is not Nathaniel Hawthorne, and to himself whether something involved in it does not express the temper of his mind, the lasting temper of all true candid men, a seeker nor a finder yet. A man now entered in neglected attire with the aspect of a thinker, but somewhat too rough-hewn and brawny for a scholar. His face was full of sturdy vigor, with some finer and keener attribute beneath. Though harsh at first, it was tempered with the glow of a large, warm heart, which had force enough to heat his powerful intellect through and through. He advanced to the intelligencer and looked at him with a glance of such stern sincerity that perhaps few secrets were beyond its scope. "I seek for truth," said he. 24 hours have elapsed since writing the foregoing. I have just returned from the haymow, charged more and more with love and admiration of Hawthorne, for I have just been gleaning through the mosses, picking up many things here and there that had previously escaped me. And I found that but to glean after this man is better than to be in at the harvest of others. To be frank, though perhaps rather foolish, notwithstanding what I wrote yesterday of these mosses, I had not then culled them all, but had nevertheless been sufficiently sensible of the subtle essence in them, as to write as I did, to what infinite height of loving wonder and admiration I may yet be borne, when by repeatedly banqueting on these mosses I shall have thoroughly incorporated their whole stuff into my being, that I cannot tell. But already I feel that this Hawthorne has dropped germinous seeds into my soul. He expands and deepens down the more I contemplate him, and further shoots his strong New England roots into the hot soil in my southern soul. By careful reference to the table of contents, I now find that I have gone through all the sketches, but that when I yesterday wrote, I had not at all read two particular pieces to which I now desire to call special attention: A Select Party and Young Goodman Brown. Here be it said to all those whom the poor fugitive scrawl of mine may tempt to the perusal of the mosses, that they must on no account suffer themselves to be trifled with, disappointed, or deceived by the triviality of many of the titles to these sketches, for in more than one instance the title utterly belies the piece. It is as if a rustic demijohns, containing the very best and costliest of Falerinian and Tokay, were labeled cider, perry, and elderberry wine. The truth seems to be that, like many other geniuses, this man of mosses takes great delight in hoodwinking the world, at least with respect to himself. Personally, I doubt not that he rather prefers to be generally esteemed but a so-so sort of author, being willing to preserve the thorough and acute appreciation of what he is. to that party most qualified to judge, that is, to himself. Besides, at the bottom of their natures, men like Hawthorne in many things deemed the plaudits of the public such strong presumptive evidence of mediocrity in the object of them, that it would in some degree render them doubtful of their own powers. Did they hear much and vociferous braying concerning them in the public pastures? True, I have been braying myself, if you please to be witty enough to have it so, but then I claim to be the first that has so brayed in this particular matter, and therefore, while pleading guilty to the charge, still claim all the merit due to originality. But with whatever motive, playful or profound, Nathaniel Hawthorne has chosen to entitle his pieces in the manner he has, it is certain that some of them are directly calculated to deceive, egregiously deceive, the superficial skimmer of pages. To be downright and candid once more, let me cheerfully say that two of these titles did dolefully dupe no less an eager-eyed reader than myself, and that too after I had been impressed with a sense of the great depth and breadth of this American man, who in the name of thunder, as the country people say in this neighborhood, who in the name of thunder would anticipate any marvel in a piece entitled Young Goodman Brown. You would, of course, suppose that it was a simple little tale intended as a supplement to Goody Two-Shoes, whereas it is deep as Dante, nor can you finish it without addressing the author in his own words. It shall be yours to penetrate in every bosom the deep mystery of sin. And with young Goodman, too, in allegorical pursuit of his Puritan wife, you cry out in your anguish. Faith, shouted Goodman Brown in a voice of agony and desperation, and the echoes of the forest mocked him, crying, Faith, faith, as if bewildered wretches were seeking her all through the wilderness. Now, this same piece entitled Young Goodman Brown is one of the two that I had not all read yesterday, and I allude to it now because it is in itself such a strong positive illustration of the blackness in Hawthorne, which I had assumed from the mere occasional shadows of it as revealed in several of the other sketches. But had I previously perused Young Goodman Brown, I should have been at no pains to draw the conclusion, which I came to at a time when I was ignorant, that the book contained one such direct and unqualified manifestation of it. The other piece of the two referred to is entitled A Select Party, which in my first simplicity upon originality, taking hold of the book, I fancied must treat of some pumpkin pie party in Old Salem, or some chowder party on Cape Cod, whereas by all the gods of pity, it is the sweetest and sublimest thing that has been written since Spenser wrote, Nay, there is nothing in Spenser that surpasses it, perhaps nothing that equals it. And the test is this. Read any canto in the Fairy Queen, and then read A Select Party, and decide which pleases you most. That is, if you are qualified to judge. Do not be frightened at this, for when Spenser was alive, he was thought of very much as Hawthorne is now, was generally accounted just such a gentle, harmless man. It may be that to common eyes the sublimity of Hawthorne seems lost in his sweetness, as perhaps in that same select party of his, for whom he has builded so august a dome of sunset clouds, and served them on richer plate than Belshazzar when he banqueted his lords in Babylon. But my chief business now is to point out a particular page in this piece, having reference to an honored guest who, under the name of the Master Genius, but in the guise of a young man of poor attire with no insignia of rank or acknowledged eminence, is introduced to the man of fancy, who is the giver of the feast. Now the page having reference to this master genius so happily expresses much of what I yesterday wrote, touching the coming of the literary Shiloh of America, that I cannot but be charmed by the coincidence, especially when it shows such a parity of ideas, at least in this one point, between a man like Hawthorne and a man like me. And here, let me throw out another conceit of mine touching this American Shiloh or master genius, as Hawthorne calls him. May it not be that this commanding mind has not been, is not, and never will be, individually developed in any one man, and would it indeed appear so unreasonable to suppose that this great fullness and overflowing may be or may be destined to be shared by a plurality of men of genius. Surely, to take the greatest example on record, Shakespeare cannot be regarded as in himself the concretion of all the genius of his time, nor as so immeasurably beyond Marlowe, Webster, Ford, Beaumont, Johnson, that these great men can be said to share none of his power. For one, I conceive that there were dramatists in Elizabeth's day, between whom and Shakespeare the distance was by no means great. Let anyone hitherto little acquainted with those neglected old authors, for the first time read them thoroughly, or even read Charles Lamb's specimens of them, and he will be amazed at the wondrous ability of those anox of men, and shocked at this renewed example of the fact that fortune has more to do with fame than merit. Though without merit lasting fame there can be none. Nevertheless, it would argue too ill of my country were the maxim to hold good concerning Nathaniel Hawthorne, a man who already, in some few minds, has shed such a light as never illuminates the earth, save when a great heart burns as the household fire of a grand intellect. The words are his in the select party, and they are a magnificent setting to a coincident sentiment of my own, but ramblingly expressed yesterday in reference to himself. Gainsay it who will, as I now write, I am posterity speaking by proxy, and after times will make it more than good when I declare that the American, who up to the present day has evinced in literature the largest brain with the largest heart, that man is Nathaniel Hawthorne. Moreover, that whatever Nathaniel Hawthorne may hereafter write, Mosses from an Old Manse, will be ultimately accounted his masterpiece. For there is a sure, though secret sign in some works, which proves the culmination of the powers, only the developable ones, however, that produce them. But I am by no means desirous of the glory of a prophet. I pray heaven that Hawthorne may yet prove me an impostor in this prediction, especially as I somehow cling to the strange fancy that in all men hiddenly reside certain wondrous occult properties, as in some plants and minerals, which by some happy but very rare accident, as bronze was discovered by the melting of the iron and brass at the burning of Corinth, may chance to be called forth here on earth, not entirely waiting for their better discovery in the more congenial blessed atmosphere of heaven. Once more, for it is hard to be finite upon an infinite subject, and all subjects are infinite. By some people, this entire scrawl of mine may be esteemed altogether unnecessary, inasmuch as years ago they may say, we found out the rich and rare stuff in this Hawthorne, who you now parade forth, as if only you yourself were the discoverer of this Portuguese diamond in your literature. But even granting all this, and adding to it the assumption that the books of Hawthorne have sold by the 5,000, what does that signify? They should be sold by the 100,000, and read by the million, and admired by everyone who is capable of admiration.